we're starting a new series called Reluctance, and we're looking at the life of Jonah. And thinking about Jonah, I can't help but ask this question. What frustrates you? What is that one thing in particular that just really gets on your nerves? You know, I think everybody has a specific frustration, something that just grates them, something that just gets under their skin more than anything else. Maybe it's bills. Maybe there's a certain time of the month or maybe every other week where you just have all your bills line up and it's frustrating. It could be just perhaps family issues. Maybe not so much a lot of family drama, but just something that a family member does time and again. We are getting around the holidays, and that can cause a lot of stress, and sometimes we might take it out on our family. Or maybe they just do something that just really frustrates us. It could be health issues, and I'm not even saying serious health issues. It could be stubbing your toe as you go up the stairs that you've gone up 100 times without fail, but you just so happen this time hit your toe. It could be a chronic backache. It could be a whole lot of things. Maybe it's that preacher that goes 10 or 15 minutes over. He should, but you know, that happens. I'm not going to apologize for that. But some things just frustrate us. Some things more than others, I think, really get under our skin. And for me personally, it's not so much something that happens on a regular basis. So you take the idea of bills, for instance, because I know in my head that either I purchased something I still need to pay for, or I need this certain item or this certain service, and I have to have it. But maybe it is that traffic that is preventing me or hindering me, and oh man, people don't know how to drive, that can frustrate me. So maybe it's not even something on a regular occurrence, but something that foils something good that you had going. You know, life throws us curveballs, and it's bound to make us frustrated. Now here's a personal question. As we begin getting into the discussion tonight, have you ever been frustrated with God? You know, we talked about a few months back with the life of Elijah. He found disappointment with God because despite everything Elijah did and the faithfulness he showed, even going up to Mount Carmel and having this great showdown, perhaps at that point Elijah thought, it is victory for me and for my God. You go to the next chapter. Elijah is a wanted man. It seems like nothing has changed, and he's disappointed. You know, we talked about disappointment, but now we're talking about frustration. We're talking about anger, personal anger you have against God. Maybe at this point in your life, you've been a Christian for an X amount of years, you're thinking, God, I thought you'd finally let up on me. I'm still having all these issues, again, whether it's health issues, financial issues, or any other kind of problems you're facing. You're thinking, God, I've been faithful. Why are you allowing these things to happen to me? Maybe you feel like God is just a little too restrictive. Or maybe the Christian walk is just a little too costly. Maybe you and God, that you just don't see eye to eye on certain things. And you're frustrated. Tonight we're talking about someone who became so frustrated he gave up on God. Thinking about Jonah, you know, what is the number one thing people remember about the story of Jonah? A fish. You know, we might think, some have called it a whale, some have called it some kind of big dinosaur that was hiding in the ocean, some just call it what Scripture is, a big old fish. You know, a lot of people think about the fish, and a lot of people, when thinking about the fish, they think, oh, that's impossible. How could an individual live inside of a big fish for 3 days and 3 nights? That's impossible. We're not going to talk about all the science behind it because, frankly, we see it as a miracle. God calls this fish to come and rescue Jonah. And there God allows Jonah to live for 3 days and for 3 nights. Let me ask you a question. Is the God that we worship, is He the God over all creation? Can God do whatever He wants to do? So if we believe that this God created this world and fashioned it, if we believe that there's this individual who built this large enough vessel to house 2 of each animal, if we believe that another individual is able to part the sea and allow the entire nation to walk on dry land, if we believe that a woman who was a virgin still gave birth to a son who was the Son of God, if we believe that Jesus Christ rose from the grave, then why do we struggle with the fish? That's the question. But I'll leave that for your thoughts. So it's really not an issue at all if we hold that God can do what He wants to do and that He can provide safety and passage for His people. But here's really what Jonah is all about tonight. Jonah is a story about love and intolerance. Jonah is a story about a man, a faithful man, who had enough with his God. He was done. See, Jonah put God inside of a box. And when God reached outside of the box, it frustrated Jonah so much to the point that he ran away from his calling. He ran away from his faith. He ran away from his God. See, Jonah teaches us about the transformative, radical love of God, and it challenges each of us to ask ourselves, do I really love others the way that God has loved me? Are we willing to share the love of God with every creature, every person, every race? What about those who commit genocide or acts of terror? Do they deserve to hear about the grace of God? Thinking about Jonah. Jonah will ask us to examine our lives and see if we can embrace such an amazing God. So let's go ahead and let's begin tonight. Jonah chapter 1. Let's just read the first 6 verses as we start our journey. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, and saying, Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare, went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea, and there was a mighty tempest of the sea, so that the ship threatened to break up. Then the mariners were afraid. Each cried out to his God, and they hurled the cargo that was in the ship into the sea to lighten it for him. But Jonah had gone down into the inner part of the ship, had laid down, was fast asleep. So the captain came and said to him, What do you mean, you sleeper? Arise, call to your God. Perhaps the God will give a thought to us, that we may not perish. Let's first of all look at this preacher who fled. Tonight's lesson is about the preacher who went overboard. That's more ways than one. But the point we want to draw from the first 6 verses is about the preacher who fled. See, with most prophetic books, most of the books of the prophets, it begins with some kind of title, some kind of name, sort of the situation, but Jonah doesn't. Jonah begins with excitement. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah. You think about that start as something is about to happen. Now here's Jonah. Jonah chapter 1 is not the first time we encounter Jonah. In fact, if we go all the way back to 2 Kings 14:25, that's the first time we ever encounter Jonah in one verse. See, at this current time, in this certain place, what was Jonah doing? Well, he was a prophet. He was under the service of the king Jeroboam II. Now, Jeroboam II, he was an evil king of Israel. But through the mercy of God, God allowed Israel to have a reprieve from the battles, from the wars, from their own inner demons, so to speak. And it was, in fact, due to the message of Jonah that the kingdom of Israel was on the up and up. It was improving economically. It was doing better. The army had become victorious. Now you think about Jonah right now. He's serving the country that he loves so much. He has the ear of the king. Jonah's living a good life right now. Jonah's doing everything that a prophet of God wished he could do. You think you're preaching and the nation is listening. At least that's what you think in your mind. The nation is improving. You're making great strides physically and spiritually through your preaching. There is nothing higher, nothing better that Jonah could have in his life. It was an ideal life. It's exactly where Jonah wanted to be. And then one day he hears, Arise, go to Nineveh, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. Here's some things about Nineveh. Well, To back up just a little bit, you think about where Jonah is. He probably has good salary, good benefits, probably has a nice home. He's comfortable. God calls him to leave everything he loves and go to Nineveh. Here are some things about Nineveh. We're not going to go into the details, and even after I tell you a little bit about Nineveh, you're going to be squirming in your seats. Imagine what I didn't tell you about Nineveh. Nineveh was the capital of Assyria, and they were a very wicked city. Assyria was perhaps the cruelest and most violent of empires during the ancient times. Their victories resulted in burning cities, mutilation, dismemberment, tortured innocent victims. The king would then boast about his victories both in writings and in speaking, in his oracles. And what he would do is he would force the friends and the family members of those who had been slain of the opposing army, he'd force the friends and family members to have a sadistic parade before himself and before the cities that belonged to him, before they were slaughtered, burned alive, or they were enslaved. Assyria was the enemy to Israel and Judah. They caused many threats, perhaps during the life of Jonah. And God called for Jonah to preach to such a wicked nation, such a wicked city within a wicked nation. It didn't make sense. It didn't make sense for Jonah. Who are these people? They're not going to listen to me. I'll be lucky if I make it to the capital. I'll be lucky if I make it into the city, let alone preach. What are they going to do when they hear me, the lone prophet from Israel, who's under their subjection? What are they going to do to me? I hope I die first. It was an insult to the nation he loved to go and try to provide mercy to their enemies. Yet God called for him to do just that. And it was too much for Jonah. One of the worst three-letter words you'll ever read in Scripture is B-U-T. But Jonah. Verse 2. We read God calling Jonah to arise and cry. Verse 3. But Jonah. See, Jonah did rise, but he went and he decided to flee. See, he decided he was supposed to go about 500 miles northeast to Nineveh. Instead, he decided he was going to go 2,000 miles west to Tarshish, which was considered at that time essentially the ends of the earth. He decided he'd rather risk his life on the sea than serve God. Now, at this point, we're not told why Jonah fled, though we could make some assumptions, and we will be told later on in chapter 4 why Jonah became so bitter and why Jonah left in the first place. But here what it is essentially. Jonah didn't trust God. He didn't believe that God knew what he was doing was best. When Jonah started playing the trust game, when he started doubting God, when Jonah started thinking, I know better than the Lord God of Israel, that's when he made his first mistake. Before he ever took one step in the opposite direction, it began in the heart. So Jonah went up and fled. I think about this. I think about my Christian life. Do we ever fall into the category of being like Jonah? Maybe we pay our Christian dues, They're due maybe when you put them in the collection plate, maybe when you attend service, morning and evening. And even Wednesday night. Oh, man, you're in the winner's circle. And when you pay your Christian dues, you have some expectations of God. You expect God to do certain things for you, like answer your prayers the way that you want them to be answered. You expect a nice life, a life where you don't have a lot of problems, a lot of issues. You expect God to take care of you because you're doing what God has called for you to do. And when God tells you to do something that is above your limit, you think, God, I don't deserve that. See, that's the game Jonah is playing here, and I have to ask myself, is that me? Do I think God is obligated? Do I demand anything from God because of my faithfulness to His Word, to serving Him? Well, here's Jonah. He's on the run. But verses 4 through 6 teach us that yes, we can run, but we cannot outrun God. And here is God. You imagine the power that is described of God. It's almost like a pitcher winding up to throw the fastball to the catcher. God takes this storm and He just hurls it at the ship like it's nothing. And there's this violent storm. It's so devastating. These veteran, experienced mariners, these sailors, are so scared. You know, why were they out there in the first place? They're transporting cargo. That's how they made their living. Guess what? If you're supposed to transport your cargo from A to B, you get to B and you don't have any cargo, no one's going to trust you to do business with you again. But they are so scared. They're taking their cargo and they're throwing it overboard so that they might survive. They don't care about their business at this point. They don't care about their retirement fund at this point. They just want to get out alive. And here they are. They're not only casting the cargo out, but they're calling upon any God that might hear them. Where's Jonah? What's Jonah doing? Is he casting cargo? Is he helping with the sails, or is he helping with the boat? Is he saying, don't worry, I worship the God who formed the seas and the dry land, the God who created everything. Everything's going to be okay. No. There's Jonah in the inner part of the ship. He's not comforting. He's not praying. He's not even admitting what he knows to be true, that it's his fault. He's sleeping. We have the same phrase we did in verse 3, so we see in verse 5, but Jonah, contrary to what Jonah should be doing, this is what he's actually doing. Notice the captain's remarks in verse 6. He said, what do you mean? What are you doing? Are you awake? Of course, this calls for us to think about when Jesus is sleeping in the boat and there's a great storm, and the disciples come in and say, do you not care that we're perishing? Notice what the captain says next. Arise, call. That's the message God told Jonah to do in the first place. So he says, arise, call out to your God. Maybe your God will pay attention. Maybe Jonah should have been paying attention. Well, let's carry on. Let's look at the next few verses. And they said to one another, come, let us cast lots, that we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. Then they said to him, tell us on whose account this evil has come upon us. What is your occupation? Where do you come from? What is your country? And what are the people are you? And he said, I'm a Hebrew. I fear the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land. Then the men were exceedingly afraid and said, and what is this that you've done? For the men knew that he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, because he had told them. Then they said, what shall we do to you that the sea may quiet down for us? The sea grew more and more tempestuous. And he said to them, pick me up, hurl me into the sea, then the sea will quiet down for you. For I know it is because of me that this great tempest has come upon you. Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to dry land, but they could not, for the sea grew more and more tempestuous against them. Then they called out to the Lord, O Lord, let us not perish for this man's life, and lay not on us innocent blood, for you, O Lord, have done as it has pleased you. So they picked up Jonah. They hurled him into the sea, and the sea ceased from its raging. Then the men feared the Lord exceedingly, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. So here's the preacher who fell. Desperate times call for desperate measures. They've thrown out the cargo. They've prayed to every god they could think of. Now they got to point fingers. Well, maybe if we can figure out whose fault this is, that's what often what happened. The mentality is, well, if there's a great natural disaster, it's somebody's fault. So they cast their lots, perhaps throwing pebbles or stones that were marked. And the lot fell on Jonah. It's amazing that God not only uses the natural, but uses man's actions to get a point across to Jonah. So they turn to him, and this is what they say. They say, who are you? Whose are you? And what have you done? They begin asking these questions, and it's so shameful when God has to use the world to discipline his own people. See, they're saying, what have you done? what really is happening is God is saying, why have you done this, Jonah? Why have you put all these men at risk? You know what I want from you. Yet you've traveled out all this way because you went against me. You didn't like what I said. Jonah confessed, I'm a Hebrew. I serve the Lord, the God of heaven. By the way, when Jonah says Lord here, he's invoking God's covenantal name, Yahweh, Jehovah. See, Jonah has a personal relationship with God, and this terrifies the sailors. It's amazing that Jonah decided to flee on sea when he then acknowledges that God created the heavens and the earth, the dry sea, or the dry land and the sea. Jonah knows he can't flee from God, but he tried it anyway. And here's Jonah. He says, this is who I serve. And they're terrified. When asked how they could assuage the wrath of this Jehovah God, Jonah responded by saying, throw me overboard. He finally understands the risk that he's put these men under when he boarded their ship. At this point, we're not really told that Jonah's repenting of anything. He doesn't know that God is going to save him. But he says, throw me overboard. He begins to be moved with pity, which is something Jonah desperately needed when dealing with unbelievers. Here's what's really interesting. What did the sailors do? Here you are. You're one of these veteran sailors. You're in the worst storm of your life. You can't see any dry land around you. There's nothing else you can do. And you find out it's all caused by the one person who wouldn't lift a finger to help you in the first place. And you know if you cast this person over the vessel, everything's going to be just fine. Would you get ready to lift? Here's what the sailors do. Nevertheless, we could almost say, but the sailors, they rowed hard. They tried to make it home. Here's what's amazing. The pagan, unbelieving sailors showed more mercy to Jonah than Jonah showed to Nineveh. While Nineveh hadn't done anything personal to Jonah, yes, Nineveh held threats against Israel, had attacked from time to time Israel, had vanquished every nation outside of Israel and Judah. It had not personally done anything against Jonah, but Jonah has done something very personal against these sailors. He's cost them their business. He's nearly cost them their lives. But they show mercy to a merciless man of God. But the storm grew worse. And it kept raging. They had no choice. I think about this and I think, what a shame it is when the world outshines the church. When the world, full of unbelieving lost souls, is more Christ-like than Christians. Thinking about these sailors. See, Jonah was a man so concerned with who deserved to hear about the grace of God, he fled in the opposite direction. Yet what he did not realize was he was going to make some believers out of these men. Even though what he did was sinful against God, God used his sinful state, his sinful actions, to make believers out of unbelievers. The storm raged. The ship was still creaking. And they said, oh God, please don't hold this against us. And they tossed Jonah overboard. Notice their reaction. The waves were gone. The ocean as smooth as glass. No more wind, no rain, no thunder. They then made vows to this God, and they respected him. And they offered a sacrifice to him. Yes, it was rudimentary. And they probably didn't do things according to the Levitical law. But Jonah made believers out of these pagans, which is exactly what he was trying to avoid doing in the first place. No matter what we think, no matter what we desire, God's will shall be done nonetheless. This is what Jonah did. Let's close tonight. Let's talk about the last verse. And the Lord appointed a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Thinking about Jonah. Did Jonah really deserve mercy? I want you to think about this supposed faithful man of God. He refused to save the souls of the tens of thousands of people in Nineveh. He ran away from God, and he did not lift a finger to help the sailors until they finally figured out it was his fault in the first place. He didn't volunteer this information. He was backed into a corner. And yes, while he showed pity for them, he never really repented as far as we know. Not till chapter 2. Did Jonah really deserve mercy? Here's the thing. If we write off Jonah now by saying what he deserved, what he didn't deserve, we'd be just like Jonah himself. Because that's the point of mercy. It's receiving something that we do not deserve. Or rather, mercy is often described as not receiving something we do deserve. Jonah received death for failing to be a man of God, a prophet of God, a voice piece for God. Yet God showed him mercy. See, the greatness of our God is not found only in His power, but it's also found in His goodness and in His love. God was not done with Jonah yet. Well, yes, He sent a storm to wake Jonah up, but He didn't want Jonah to die. See what God does here. This God Jonah didn't trust, whose message Jonah denied, whose character Jonah doubted. He saved Jonah in the most unusual way. He showed Jonah mercy. See, Jonah went down to Joppa. He went down into the ship. He went down into the depths of the ocean. And finally, he went down into the belly of the fish before he was stripped of his independent, self-righteous pride, and he fully experienced the mercy of God. See, for Jonah and for us, sometimes we have to reach the depths, the bottom of the ocean before we can learn to depend on God. That's what happened with Jonah. Jonah finally learned to appreciate the grace of God. As we close tonight, I have some questions for you. Have you ever been frustrated with God? Has God ever been too restrictive? Has He asked for you to do a little too much? Perhaps you're running tonight. Perhaps you become so angry with God, or perhaps you think that you know what is best, and God must be mistaken. Perhaps over the past months, or perhaps over the past year, you've slowly been inching away from God, doing whatever you can to distance yourself from God, and you're running. You know, God sent a storm to wake up Jonah. A lot of people, when they leave God for a period of time, and you talk to them and you say, why don't you come back to God? And they say, I'm nervous. I'm scared. What's God going to do to me? I once heard a woman say, if I ever walked into that church building, God would strike it with lightning. And she was serious. Well, here's my question. Why are we so concerned about what God's going to do to us when we come back and not be concerned about what God's going to do to us if we don't? The fact that we fled in the first place led to a response from God. Furthermore, Jesus described the sinner who repents, who comes home, as a time of complete forgiveness and celebration. Finally, perhaps the storms you're facing in your life are not punishments from God. Rather, they're wake-up calls. Rather, God is nudging you, gently whispering, calling for you to come home. He's looking for you, and He's found you. He's ready and willing to save you. Perhaps you need to go overboard. Perhaps you need to do the one thing you never thought you could ever do. And that is to turn around with a humble heart and head back to God. Because you can run, but you can't outrun God. So stop the running. Embrace the love and mercy and grace of God and fulfill your purpose. If you're a child of God tonight and you've been running, maybe you haven't been running, but you started putting the distance between yourself and God. Listen to God's call. Come back tonight. Maybe you aren't a child of God. Understand the great power God has is only superseded by the great love God has shown you. Don't allow God's love to be wasted tonight. Don't allow the call to go unheeded. Arise and be baptized and have your sins washed away, calling on the name of the Lord. If you need anything tonight, don't be like Jonah. Don't head in the opposite direction. Come home. Come now while we stand, while we sing.